thank you so much for joining us at this warm July for many, and also many on holidays. So we got a good turnout regardless, which is great stuff. I hope none of you are on holiday. But anyway, so today's topic is titled Learnings from Our Collection Value Scoring Workshops. And also we're going to sneak in some updates from Hortis, from the engineers. So I'm Havard, Ostgaard, CEO of Botanical Software. Together with me, we have Waheed, Dr. Waheed Arshad.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, really lovely to see you all, and even more lovely to have met some of you at the recent conferences.
Yeah, great. Greg, I was going to say great, but then I was also going to introduce Greg Payton, who's sort of our, what shall I call it, guest on most of these webinars. Thank you for joining again, Greg.
I'm just here for the jokes, so.
Yeah, so Greg is Living Collections Director at the Dawes Arboretum in the warm Ohio at the moment. Yeah.
As I was just, sharing, luckily we've escaped most of the heat that's been in the central part of the country, so we're certainly better than others.
Yeah. Okay. So, and in addition, so the workshop we had, which we hosted at the or co-presented at the EuroGard Congress in Budapest in May, together with Martin Smit at the Hortus in Amsterdam. Now, Martin, congratulate him on his new position at Utrecht University. Maybe you could say hi, Martin.
Oh, hi, everybody. Yeah.
So we have one slide with Martin's findings. So from the work that we did with him, and then also Sam Brockington, curator at Cambridge University, is also here, who co-presented with us in Portland in June virtually, which was great. So maybe you can also say hi, Sam, if you like.
Hello.
Okay, brilliant. So everybody who presented are here, which is great. And so before we start, I would like, so we're going to do a poll at some point later on. So if you could just scan this QR code now, then you will also see the slides on your phone. There might be some benefits to that, but we will repeat the code when we get to the, if you don't feel like it, so you can, but anyway, that will be cool. So we're going to just do one poll just to get some more insight, because that's what was so wonderful with the workshops at the Congress and the conference, of learning more about what the community find important. So maybe, hopefully I wasn't too quick here. I'm guessing I wasn't. Good. So I'm looking for faces to see. So forgive. But anyway, we'll send it. We'll send the link on the chat when we get to the poll anyway, if you didn't get it. So as I mentioned earlier in the initial start of the presentation here, we're going to focus on summary from the workshops and look at what we've learned from both of these. We have sort of collated some of that data. And then we also want to learn a bit more about how you think this might help your institution. And then we're also going to talk about a bit what we're doing about it now and in the future in terms of Hortis and the work we do. Okay, so for those of you, we assume that a few of you didn't join the, I think some of you didn't join any of these workshops. So we'll try to sort of summarize the presentation we had, which was a 90-minute workshop. But first of all, the motivation about value scoring or collection value scoring. And what is interesting is that businesses in general, they measure their ability to run a business by financial metrics and other internal metrics. And this is how institutions have evolved over time. And of course, with the introduction of computerization, there were much more opportunities of how you measure things. And why do you measure things? Well, it's basically to give you some data to make informed decisions. It's quite obvious in many ways. You can look at your bank account and see how much money can I purchase this car, etc. It's like a metric, but of course, with the bigger institutions, it's budgets, etc., etc. And then in the University Botanic Gardens, there is also some metrics that people are very familiar with. A question about how many plants do you have? And some gardens are able to answer that question with high level of accuracy. Others not so much. And this is sort of evolved into, for example, asking people, how many taxa do you have? Which is more of an interesting number often, because it gives you some sort of idea about the diversity of your collection. So these are the very fundamental basic metrics. Now, value scoring is going one step further, trying to sort of help you to make informed decisions on a bigger on a richer data set. And that is where we are in terms of trying to discover how this can be done, and how tools can help you to do that, because obviously it has to be worthwhile in terms of the effort you put in and what you get out. So that was sort of the motivation behind this whole workshop and the webinar and everything else we've done about this so far. As I mentioned, especially, I think it goes for all institutions, that very few institutions, if any, have unlimited resources. So the more tools and data you have to guide you, the better. So you can make sort of good decisions on how you run your sort of institution. And it's all based on your mission. Obviously, you have a garden for a reason, and that's what this is all about. Again, trying to understand how you measure that you're moving towards your goals to serve your mission. And I will hand over to Waheed, who will talk a bit about the work that Sam and his team at Cambridge University carried out on collection value scoring.
Yes, thank you, Havard. Yeah, basically, we've looked at a couple of case studies, working with a few other gardens, and this is just an example of how you might approach looking at the value of your collection. Now, at Cambridge, these are kind of some of the metrics that they've looked at. For example, the rarity of a species, and how rare that particular species is in terms of ex situ collections globally. The diversity, which could be either taxonomic diversity, or indeed it could be by geographic diversity as well. The proportion of accessions that are derived from the wild is also a good indicator that some gardens may use. Extinction risk is often one very common metric that people will use, and that's based on conservation assessments. So is the taxon, critically endangered, or is it extinct in the wild, and how that might influence whether or not you prioritize that particular group of plants. Then there's things like seed banking as well. So, what proportion of your collection might be held in seed, in sort of cryopreserved material as well. And related to the wild origin story is the provenance. So is the provenance information actually available? Do you have that? Because if you think about more research focused collections, knowing something is wild, but without the locality details, there's often some limited value of that type of scenario. There's also the degree of duplication. Do you have multiple accessions being maintained per species? Then there's things like longevity and sustainability that gives you more of a sense of turnover, the influx of accessions versus the efflux, and that's more of an indicator of the quality of the management of the collection, which is also very interesting. And finally, down on the bottom right, which many of you probably recognize, the plant, and that's certain taxa that have exceptional interest. This might be somewhat subjective because it's quite difficult to quantify, but you might have a species that you see as a particular value in terms of visitor interest, for example, and that Amorphophallus is a very good example of such a species. Now, Sam looked at this in more detail in relation to his collection over the last 20 or so years, and here is just a summary of some of the metrics that he and his team have gone into. And I'm just going to mention here the word longitudinal. Now, some of you may be familiar or have heard of this term from the medical industry. And it basically means the repeated analysis of a particular group of subjects over time. So in our case, we are looking at plant records, but obviously in the medical industry, they're looking at patients. Now, the importance of this is that looking at the same plant records over time or within your collection, you can start to see trends. And here there are some of the trends that Sam and his team have looked into in more detail. For example, the change in the number of species over time, the proportion of accessions and the provenance of those accessions, the change in the number of families, so a sense of taxonomic diversity, and also down on the bottom right, the change in the number of red listed species over time. And you can see certain dips and peaks, for example, in 2012, and how that might relate to particular events in the garden or particular staffing changes or differences in policies, for example. So that's all very interesting and can give you a very insightful kind of approach into how your collection has evolved over time. Similarly, at the Hortus in Amsterdam, we looked at some metrics related to their core collections, so kind of focused on particular taxa, for example, their cycads and their palms and pelargoniums, and then also combining those with conservation metrics that look at the status of those taxa in terms of conservation and their provenance, as well as data health. And we were able to apply more of a pilot study to their particular collection to see how, when we normalize the scores and track those over time, can we see changes and can we link those and try and better understand how that collection has evolved over time. Now, Martin, did you want to comment on any of these particular changes? For example, in 2017, you know, we see a difference there.
Yeah, so I mean, some of those reflect changes in policy. So in 2017, there was a more strict policy in terms of acquisition of plants related to core collections. But one of the most interesting graphs not being shown here is also the, you had to condense this down, but it's actually the average time between updates, which is quite interesting because it actually, you can clearly see if that graph was to be shown when we started using Floria and getting staff involved, and you could see those numbers coming down. So the accuracy of the data actually increased over time. So that's also something to remember. When you see things go down, that is when the database indicates that things went down, but it could just indicate that you've actually done some collection counts and actually did inventories at that point in time. So it's always important to look carefully at these when you interpret those. So, but that's pretty much what I have to add. Yeah.
Brilliant. We actually will come on to the data freshness story a bit later on, and we'll look exactly at that graph that Martin was talking about. Thank you, Martin. We also had a pilot study with the Dawes Arboretum. So similarly, we looked at certain metrics relating to collections on particular taxa, for example, Acer, Aesculus, and Metasequoia hamamelis. And then we also combined that with conservation collections and data health to look at how, again, that has changed over time. And in the next slide, we have a graph that summarizes this. Now, I know I'm going very quickly to give you an overview, but Greg, did you want to comment on this?
It works better when I click the button. Okay. Yeah, you know, if you look at the yellow bar there, that's basically our taxa count, and you can see it's been mostly flat, but blue indicating the size of the collection, basically the number of accessions of each of those plants has increased over time, whereas the plants of no value have mostly stayed the same. So that offhandedly reflects a reduction of numbers because the number of accessions went up, but the number of plants of less value looks flat here, but it indicates that it went down. It's sort of hard to visualize, but that really shows a focus that I've especially been working on in the past few decades, is trying to make sure that our species plants are of quality documented wild origin, and taking out those same taxa species that don't have, that are like nursery origin or have very poor data. Similarly with cultivars, trying to ensure that those are the best represented individuals of that cultivar. So, propagated as close to directly from the original cultivar, and then, having, cultivar selections that are important due to trials and other features. And it was indicated on the previous slide about our PCN, the Plant Collections Network program here through the American Public Gardens Association, where it's basically like the national collections in Europe. So it's, we are the national collection holders for those 4 genera, and the cultivars of those. So there's many cultivars of maple, Aesculus, obviously, less so of Dawn Redwood and Witch Hazel, still quite a few, but those are important collections for us. So holding those cultivar collections, those are of higher importance to us because of that national collection status. Make sense?
Wonderful. So that's a very key point that Greg mentioned. These types of approaches have to be related to your mission and your kind of approach as a garden in terms of your collection policy. So depending on why you have your collections, the types of metrics you might be looking at will vary. And the one that we saw earlier from Cambridge is a good example of one that might be more focused on research and conservation, for example. So moving on, how can this type of approach be standardized? Well, we've just talked about particular focuses on research and conservation. So, you might want to lean more on the provenance and, global and regional conservation assessments. But the point is that this type of approach, we want to enable you to fine tune it based on your particular mission. So despite the more complex formula, we want to try and help you to kind of approach it in a more friendly way.
Yeah, and so standardization, we think that there's so initially when we started looking at this, we thought about, giving a score, as like our garden is worth 2,749 points today, and it was slightly less tomorrow or yesterday. But we realized quite soon that there are more metrics that you need to look at. But the key aspect that's been mentioned many times already is the mission. And of course, the institutional diversity you find in botanic gardens is immense. So coming with one model for everybody wouldn't work probably, or probably with a high level of certainty. So what we did at the webinars or workshops we had was to try to do some, as many of you joined us before, we love word clouds. So get some sense of what this, what people are thinking when they hear this idea about measuring their collection. And we did one slide, or one group was focused on, in Budapest, we split up in groups, whereas at APGA or in the American Public Garden Association conference, we did the whole group as one over using a word cloud on the device. And so we curated that that feedback, and it's, as you can see, quite diverse. So don't expect you to read all this in one go. But what we see is that there are some. So these are, the question is, how do you measure your collection from a sort of standpoint of research, conservation, and educational value? What would you use as measures in your garden? And the outcome here is presented here on the screen. I think this is from about 100 people plus from 2 different workshops. And what there's the obvious winners are conservation status, sort of we've curated this a bit because people on the website write different things, and the conservation status might mean global conservation versus regional conservation. Those both equally important. The other part is provenance, of course, wild collected versus garden origin, etc. And research value is also top. Everybody sees that as obvious things. And now we're looking more in detail on this data. We've some other more sort of enlightened observations. One was referring to wild crop relatives as an important indicator for value. If that relates to your mission, it makes a lot of sense. Rearing cultivation, I think Sam and Cambridge work also put a very focus on that. And that's one metric that's quite hard to measure, because rearing cultivation, meaning who has this type of species in their collection. And that's where maybe the future lies with more integrated data sharing across the planet. Another one was habitat breadth, or maybe it's not necessarily exactly the same as geographic range, but maybe more like a niche kind of plant species. They are very important in terms of plant conservation again. And another one here is biocultural diversity. I thought that was very, very, very specific. So if your focus is on ethnobotany, etc., then you might want to focus on that. So I don't know if you have anything to add to this, Waheed, or anybody else for that matter. We'll share this with you anyway, so you get access to this.
I was going to ask if Sam wanted to comment any further on the rearing cultivation story, because that was very interesting.
I really had 2 points in my talk, which so you showed the first one, and that's fine, about longitude analysis. But I think I had sort of 2 main takeaways from what we've done. One is the importance of longitude analysis, because they give you a trajectory over a snapshot value, which is very difficult to interpret. And the other is the importance of the global analyses. And I think there are actually quite a lot of values here. One could argue conservation status, rare and cultivation, endemism. All of these things require a global context to them. I agree. Sort of version 2.0 of all of this is where you have all gardens, fully integrated and fully aware of what each other have and all of that kind of thing. I have to say, I don't think it's particularly difficult to establish rearing cultivation right now. It's you submit your list of everything you're growing to BGCI, and then you get a readout back against that list, which tells you exactly how many other gardens are growing that particular taxon. So I think that data is accessible with current technology. I just don't think it's not automatic. And there are people. I've had a conversation recently with another curator who really pushes back at that being important. Why is rarity in cultivation remotely important? But this is where you get to the different values, different foci.
Well, that's very good point as well in terms of mission. I suppose your outlook or your sort of position at Cambridge is a global context, but I suppose some gardens, I don't know whether that's in their mission or not. If that, from Dawes Arboretum's perspective, your mission is quite clearly local, isn't it, Greg?
Yeah, we obviously want to have collections of value, rare specimens, rare species, conservation status. But we've also been working toward a new model where we have identified areas of the grounds, like near our visitor center and more public areas, where we don't keep rare plants. We basically just plant pretty plants and things from nurseries and perennials and things like that, just to have folks that come in to visit the garden, walk a path and see pretty things. And that's a tool we're using to increase visitation, which increases the revenue through membership and donations, and volunteerism and other things like that to help support our collections of plants that might not be so pretty. So it's sort of a two-pronged approach where we're sort of a botanical garden for attractive, cultivation upon entry, but then the fringes and other areas have the conservation collections that are of important value for the future of taxa on a more worldwide level. So
since we're having a slightly open discussion, I wasn't going to ask this, but since we've got a bit of an opportunity, is it possible can I ask a question about your equation?
You mean as from Greg's metrics?
No, the one you presented, the maths slide, like two slides before.
Oh yeah, that was just more. Yeah, okay. We can go back to that quickly. Yeah.
So
yeah, sorry,
I don't want to interrupt the flow, but there's always been this. I've seen various attempts at this scoring system, and I've never seen anyone really drill into the pitfalls of scoring like this. So in the sense that what you're doing is integrating across a lot of measures into a single value, and in doing that, you lose perspective on which particular values are driving the score, right? So you might have, a terrible provenance across the whole garden, but it's driven very high by other things, right?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think that's we'll probably come to that to some degree, because that's exactly this thought process. When we worked with Martin and looked at their data, and to some degree also with Greg's data, we realized that specific thing of having graphs and what lies underneath is of course vital. Is it up to date? Is it accurate? Is it complete? And so what? If I understood your comment correctly, then maybe I hope I did. So we come to the next slide, which. So in addition to these metrics, we started together with Amsterdam and Martin to look at data health as a metric, and this is the idea here is to inform you on what you're doing with your data. How many plants have been identified or verified? How many plants have plant condition and other metrics that indicates that the data you have about this particular species are of high reliability, and that should be sort of we think we're not sure how this will sort of be implemented in real time, but this should inform the model, we think, or maybe be a separate metric, but at least give you an idea that okay, you have a wonderful graph here, but you haven't seen some of these plants for 10 years. So can you really claim that this is right? So all those kind of things. So looking at this from Amsterdam, but also the discussion we had, a couple of things. Plant identification is of course vital. You can claim you have a lot of endangered specimens, but it's been, not identified by any specialists. That becomes questionable, etc. And completeness, etc. There's a lot of things there, but what we sort of ended up with was very data freshness is basically also a very important aspect here. And we're looking at for example, at an arboretum, a Quercus that hadn't been checked for 4 years is very likely to be there still. But if it's herbaceous material, then it might not, etc. So there's a bit of a complexity there, but that I think is a very important part of the learning from this particular, from where we are now. Was that aligned with what you were commenting on, Sam?
It's not quite the same point, but I don't want to hold you up if you want to keep going.
Okay, okay, then I misunderstood. Anyway, but anyway, so but one thing is clear: you get a number, and this number gives you some idea about where you are. But obviously, it can be a distraction if everything underneath is questionable. for various reasons. So we group these things in threes, but we also want to learn a bit more about how people would measure their collection from a horticulture or heritage perspective. And the reason, some gardens are purely, there are some gardens are purely focused on heritage or historic missions, and others are much more focused on horticulture than research conservation. So these are equally important. And what we see here is things like, again, provenance, but also rearing cultivation is still important. Uniqueness is typically one aspect around horticulture, something that's very special. So we'll share these slides so you can have a closer look at those at leisure. Okay. So we're going to have, I think we're ready for a poll now. So if you could use your device, maybe we'll send a link to this, we'll do that, send a link to the chat here as well. So if you have value scoring, who would it impact at your garden and beyond? Thank you, Waheed. So you could put three different points. Maybe we should be more generous than 3, but we have 3 now. So choose wisely. Isn't that what they say? And as you put your proposals in here, they will pop up on the screen. So for everybody to share, so to see, I mean. Yeah, funders, yeah. Management committee, yeah.
But I think it really depends on what you attach that value to, right?
Yeah, exactly. It is a difficult question to answer, because when you see here other botanic gardens, you obviously need to, are you comparing apples or are you comparing? It's very difficult. So I agree.
Because I, just to come back to my point, from a collections management perspective, the more you integrate across a range of different metrics and give a single value, the more you obscure actually what as a manager you want to really look at, which is sort of the raw inputs into that value. But at the same time, the way we use collection values probably mostly is to inform horticulturalists in a very simple way about what, according to the criteria that we hold dear in the curation team, what are the most important plants that they need to safeguard or prioritize for water in a dry spell or that kind of thing. But like a value at the level of the entire collection.
Yeah, I think I know what you're getting at, Sam, and I think we've had these, Harvard, I think we've also had these discussions, and the thing is, I think if you see it like your car's dashboard and you see the speed of your car, I mean, you get an overview, but these values only become valuable if you see you're reducing speed. But why are you reducing speed? So you need to drill down into those values, and so they give a good indication. But you have to be careful to overanalyze them. And I think one of the conclusions we came to as well, depending on, of course, your mission and vision. So a collection that's purely display focused is quite different to one that's research and conservation focused. So if you have a general parameter and general parameters, you have to be careful how you look at these. You almost need parameters for every type of collection that you have, and in an ideal world you would be able to see a big sort of overview and be able to drill down for each of those values to get a real idea of what's going on.
Yep, exactly. I know. I think that's what some of the summary. We come to the next slide as well. Is about measuring trends, not measuring numbers, or looking at trends. So if you measure your, and you probably won't have one, but maybe more metrics to measure or track. And then the trends are the ones that informs you. So not the actual number itself. But obviously, if the model is wrong from the start, it's then becomes very much a tricky proposition. But that's why we have these workshops, to learn more and to figure out and fine tune this idea. But here's a number of interesting funders funding. That's one I think is very interesting. You know, in terms of measuring trend, to see we have this. This is where we're heading, and we want to basically increase our conservation efforts or whatever, and then you can see the graph going up. But then, of course, you need to dig into the numbers to explain why they're going where they are. So that's the way we look at it now, at least as a dashboard kind of indicator, a pulse or a thermometer, if you like, not a sort of exact science. Okay, thank you so much for taking part. Let's go to the next slide here. So to summarize, what we've learned is that what I mentioned earlier, the number itself is almost pointless to have it just a snapshot, which also Sam pointed out. And the second part, which is quite obvious, but still it should reflect your mission. And one problem with these ideas is, of course, if you change your workflow in the garden, if you have if you have inconsistent behavior in terms of record keeping, the whole model becomes flawed again. So these things need to be taken into account if that's part of it. Now, data freshness again can't be over emphasized. And as we have mentioned multiple times, if you're going to measure trend, you need longitudinality. You need to be able to record and have data over time that is reliable. Now, what several have mentioned already, these metrics on the lower level can be extremely useful to inform you how you put your efforts in your garden, which plants should be inventoried first, which plants should be looked after more, etc. We briefly haven't mentioned this tonight, but the Dodo plant story, so the idea of the last one in your collection is very important to save, but it should not inform the value of the collection beyond the fact that it's an important plant. It doesn't increase the value of a collection because you have one left. It's a bit of a interesting sort of anomaly in terms of how you might look at this. And the last thing we also learned is that it's very helpful to normalize your metrics. So don't look at number 2,400, but just look at something from 0 to 100 and 0 to 1, so that it becomes easy to talk and discuss and share. Okay, we're just keeping track of time here. I'm going to move on to our next slide. So we're going to then talk a bit about how we are looking at this from Hortis. Some of you may have not heard about Hortis, so I'm going to briefly mention what Hortis is about from a sort of lower level. The key for Hortis is to make owning a plant record system as easy as possible. So it works on anything. And it is designed on the cloud, so it's designed to be a collaborative tool. And as it is on the cloud, you also have, we've seen that through COVID, etc. You want to be able to access your tools wherever you are and when you need it. So you just consume it on your smartphone or whatever, and you can log in and nothing needed in terms of installation. And of course, we know the diversity of botanic gardens and the staff. You joined the community of botanic gardens not because you were a technologist or a sort of a tech geek, but you're just normal people who want to use sort of tools. And by having a designer, we believe we can create tools that are very forgiving or easy to adopt and use and get started with. Here you see on the right side an early version of our dashboard where you give a provenance snapshot, and this is where typically we would see over time trends on your collection, for example. What's going on? Your metrics are going in one direction or another, for example. So it gives you an idea of understanding what's happening in your collection. And one thing we have already done in Hortis is to look after longitudinality, and that is done by the fact that every time you save things, you store a new revision of your record. This is quite exciting because it opens up a lot of opportunities of how you can manage and analyze your data over time. So that means you have a full audit trail, but you also have that sense of trust you might give that you don't lose anything. You just create a new revision. And that's quite exciting for analytics, but also for other things like draft approval. So you can include more people in your garden to take part in collection management. Because not only can we revert things that have been done, but you can also put things as a proposal for other people's to approve. So some of these things are already in place, but the whole bottom sort of technology is already running on Hortis, and it's already we're already reaping benefits from that. And I think Waheed's going to take over and do a quick demo, so fitting in what we have time for here today of a few things in Hortis. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Yep, I will just very, very quickly show you. So Hortis works because it's cloud-based and it's web-based. Each garden has their own individual URL, and this is typically how they would log in. So you type in your URL or go directly to it, and logging in, we give you an option to either log in with your own email address or password, or you can authenticate via Google or Microsoft. So some of your institutions might have these as your kind of default workspace. So I'm just going to go ahead and log in with my Google account. And like a lot of these things, it will remember your password. So it's one less to remember. And in the home page, as Havard mentioned, we've got a very quick overview of what our collection looks like today and the snapshot of the provenance. Down the left, we have quick access shortcuts, and over in the account settings, you can do bed management, garden management, and account management. Let's go straight into the plant materials. You can see here a list of those in your garden. We've got kind of basic searching already in place that's quite advanced already with things like misspellings. So you see I've intentionally misspelled it, but we're still returning all of the relevant records. So, if you might not be familiar with scientific names, or you have spelling errors in your collection. Similarly with shorthand searches, that's also working very well. And if I go into an individual record, for example, this Tillandsia, you can see a reference to that audit log that Havard mentioned. So here you can see that the record was created 6 days ago, and every single change that has been made is getting logged. So individual fields that are being changed, who's done it as well, because every user on Hortis has their own user account. So you've got that full transparency there as well. And when we go into photographs, for example, you can set different featured images based on what's relevant for you. You can upload more as well, and also share to other colleagues, either within your garden or others outside of your garden who have been granted access. So there's a lot of collaborative tools already in place there. Now, when I go to the map very quickly, just to show you how that's looking like, we've got these vector-based maps with kind of a lot of power, again, with searching. So if I try a different search, for example, Mesembryanthum crystallinum, which I'm not going to spell, but you can see you don't have to. So you've got that kind of flexibility there already when it comes to searching. Similarly, if we go back to our Tillandsia, you can see the rest of the data associated with that, as well as the full audit log. And if I wanted to move this Tillandsia, which is relatively easy because it's a simple plant to move most times, and if I just put it here, for example, and confirm that change, you'll see that in the audit log, the coordinates have been changed and the lat long has been registered. So there's a lot of flexibility there when it comes to mapping, and we also have satellite imagery now available to give you a lot more accuracy when you're plotting the coordinate data. Lastly, I'll just very quickly show you how this looks like on a mobile phone. just to give you a sense of how it's looking. In the list view, for example, the same information is displayed, but just visually slightly differently. So the information is stacked slightly differently. So you've got a lot of options there to be using it on multiple devices wherever you are in the garden.
Yeah, a couple of takeaways there as well is, first of all, that we design everything to work on the mobile first. So all the workflows that you have in the garden should be possible on the mobile, which requires a lot of design skills, which we are happy to possess. And the second part is the mapping story, where we design this so that you should be able to be in the map all day if you like, and carry on doing your plant record keeping on the map, adding new plants to the map, etc. So that just gives you that kind of second dimension to your collection, which is sometimes extremely valuable. And Waheed is also, our next step is to look for 3D mapping as well, so you can get your epiphytes stacked on top of each other. We're not there yet, but the technology is almost there. The last thing to say about the maps here as well is, you might see it, it's quite hard to show here, but it's very fluid. It's because it's vector based, even though it runs on the browser, it does really slide in and out very nicely. So yeah. Great, thank you so much, Waheed. I'm going to share my screen again and see if we can. So in terms of value scoring and Hortis, the key aspect now is to get the longitudinality in, which we have, and the second part is then to carry on the data health aspects first and foremost, so that people can curate their data or are informed about their sort of data health situation, you might say. So dealing with that, we know that we want to then help gardens to make sort of conscious decisions on what kind of plants should be looked at first. Typically plants that have been looked at for a long time, etc. And another aspect further down the line is plant condition. If you say that your condition of plants should be informed the model, or should inform your model, if you say a plant is of good health, that metric is basically valuable for a very short time. So there are many of those things. And the other part that we're definitely going to work on further down the line is also things like plant conservation status. That's also data that is available, global data, and you make sure you have the right data there. And that's something having a cloud platform, we could do that for the whole community instead of people curating this on their own. So data freshness and data quality is sort of, and longitudinality is our main focus on Hortis for now. And then we will iterate further down the line to go into the more nitty-gritty on value scoring models and configuration around that. Here's the one slide, Martin, that we looked at, data freshness, and maybe you want to add your comments now if you have something to add.
Oh yeah, just it's a point I mentioned earlier, and that's just that of course when you interpret your data, you have to be careful. Because if you looked at that graph that Waheed showed earlier, it might look like a lot of plants died in 2017, 2018, but if you dig down into the data, and when we analyzed the data freshness, basically what we saw is that's when we started doing inventories in the collection. And you can clearly see the point where we started actually in like 2019, when we started using Floria and got gardeners involved. You can see that basically the graph going down, the red line, is a good thing. That means there's fewer days between status updates. And then, of course, there's another line which indicates where it goes up again. And that's when when colleagues had to be retrenched and we were dealing with all sorts of other crises. But these sorts of, even just this trend alone can be really helpful to give you an indication if your data is a true reflection of what's going on in the garden. So this is... Can
I just ask,
yeah.
Because all of this data precedes is Hortus, right? So this is coming out of Iris, am I right?
Yep.
That's correct. Yeah.
So I think we've been using recency. We've been using the green line. What's that? Recency of update, basically. And I really like average day since last observed is a neater metric, actually. But is all of that, sorry to talk about the competition, but is all of that data still, that retrospective data stored in Iris?
Well,
yeah,
you can go ahead and explain how
yeah,
it's
no, this is together with Martin and the Hortus to download the data and actually do sort of data munching on the raw data. So it's not a metric as such. But you can derive it by analyzing the core data. Yeah.
Right. So that core data is held in Iris somewhere.
Yeah. It just requires a lot of munching because I can pick up with that thread with you afterwards, Sam, and give you some access to that.
I'd be really interested just to explore the orange line, because it's partly because we adopted Floria at a similar time, but we've been evaluating it in terms of sort of number of records that we're getting in, or sort of the amount of activity generally around Floria. But I'd be really interested to explore whether we see a similar trend after the introduction and sharing the responsibility with the Hort staff. I think it'd be very interesting to see that.
Yep, we can replicate that model. I'll get in touch with you to dig into that.
Yeah, just as a clarification for anyone that might not be familiar with IRIS-PG, but it does have what's called history to each item. So every time you update a location, a date, or a few other features, it stores a record of what it was previously. So you can use that data to then say the date since last update, or the time since last update.
Okay, well, that's very good. Great. So in terms of Hortis, we've already mentioned this, focus on the so what we're doing is to have an information about when any plant was last observed. That comes that will have an important part of how data is managed in Hortis. And then we have added something called follow-up cycle. So you could, at this point, we're basically starting off by saying every plant should be checked at least once a year. And you think, okay, if you have an arboretum, but actually when you get new plant material into your collection, you should probably monitor it at a higher frequency anyway until it is established. So this is a first iteration on that idea. And then you could then be informed about plants that are basically, it becomes like an expiration date on your collection or on your plants basically. So that's where we are there. And again, we will keep on iterating on that particular model as well.
So I mean, you talk about data freshness and the impact that has on data quality, but also it would be interesting to know that for stuff that is of higher quality, that you have better data freshness, right? The inverse, because that's what you're trying to drive. For your most valuable material, you're prioritizing your data harvesting effort.
Exactly, and that's kind of, we talked with Martin, for example, we looked at how many, if they're going to keep track of all their collection, how many plants should they inventory per month? And you see that number is impossible with the staff you have. Then you see, okay, look at the scores or the metrics, and then we could do targeted efforts to increase your, increase the data quality for what matters. So that's really great, I think. The other part around that was it's a simple thing like plant identification or verification. Another effort where you can do targeted effort around those plant material that is perceived to be of value but have very low. That we saw a few of those as well in your collection, Martin, where we thought that that's definitely an effort that could increase basically the reliability of your collection score as well. So the score will go up. So
Yeah, exactly, and that's quite important, because if plants haven't been verified, you actually one of the most important things, if you're saying it's a certain taxa and it hasn't been verified, there's a question mark around that. So that's quite important there. Yeah.
Cool. So let's see, we have one more slide here, I think. And yeah, this is more like a summary. So I think it's quite obvious for many of you already, but if we get this right, I think it can make a big impact on how you are able to run your collection. But what's for sure is that we're still a journey ahead of us in terms of trying to figure out how this will be, how this can be done in an optimal manner. But some very valuable. I'm really grateful for everybody who has participated at the workshops, and also particularly also for those who co-presented, Martin, Sam, and Greg. So really, really useful and enjoyable. This is really, really something that we look forward to see taking place in Hortis and in the community as a whole. So thank you very much for joining, and we hope to see you again when our next webinar comes up. So if you subscribe to our blog, you get a notification when that happens. And yeah, thank you so much.